far from the blazing battlefronts of Europe. In the warm seas of colonial India, a dark shadow loomed over Allied shipping routes. Off the coast of Goa, then a Portuguese colony, entire convoys vanished with a precision too uncanny to be mere chance. Germans, hunted with an almost supernatural instinct, sinking ships mere hours after they set sail. At the heart of this mystery stood an unsettling figure, a seemingly abandoned freighter, a rusted ship baking under the Indian sun, hiding secrets deadlier than any torpedo. Allied intelligence realized the only way to pierce this veil was to send men to that ship, to destroy it, and if captured, to deny their very existence. The operation being planned would have no official name or recognition, only the certainty that failure would mean being erased from history. When war broke out in September 1939, 3 massive German merchant ships, the Ehrenfels, the Braunfels, and the Drachenfels, found themselves trapped in an unexpected limbo, each carrying over 7,000 tons of steel and cargo. They tried to evade British surveillance, seeking refuge in neutral waters. They found sanctuary in the port of Mormugao, under the Portuguese flag, where international law offered both protection and captivity. They could remain indefinitely, but were forbidden from sailing. There, they fell into a strange hibernation, encrusted with rust, their crews dispersing into the colonial heat. A year later, a 4th ship joined them, the Italian Amphora, and this cluster of ships, seemingly idle and of no military value, blended into the tropical landscape. But beneath this facade of dormant vessels, something was brewing that would alter the war in the Indian Ocean. To the casual observer, the merchant ships appeared as floating skeletons, abandoned under the scorching sun, to passing captains or curious tourists. They were merely old hulks of steel condemned to oblivion. Yet, beneath their decayed appearance, a sinister plan was unfolding. At first, British naval intelligence dismissed the matter as a minor issue. Inert ships, without weapons or mobility, bound by Portuguese neutrality. The Admiralty had bigger priorities, chasing German surface raiders, encountering the wolf packs ravaging the Atlantic. But by 1942, the strategic landscape shifted dramatically. The Indian Ocean became a vital artery for the Allied war effort, laden with oil from the Persian Gulf, Malayan rubber, Burmese tin, and African grains, essential for armies fighting from the North African desert to the jungles of Burma. The great ports of Bombay and Karachi bustled, with docks overflowing with freighters, tankers and transports ready to supply distant fronts. But naval escorts were scarce, stretched too thin to cover thousands of miles of ocean. This void became a paradise for U-boats, from bases in occupied France, and later from Penang, in Japanese-controlled Malaya. German submarines stalked with clinical precision. Their attacks were ruthless, torpedoes slicing through moonlit waters, deck guns spewing fire at already crippled merchant ships, entire packs coordinated like wolves on their prey. By late 1942, sinkings numbered in the dozens, with ships going down mere hours. After leaving the safety of port, routes thought to be secure turned into veritable graveyards of the sea. British listening posts, scattered across India, began detecting a disturbing pattern. In a nondescript setup, operated a special operations executive outpost, bristling with antennas and cipher equipment. There, they intercepted coded transmissions that went beyond routine submarine communications. These were methodical reports, details of routes, cargoes, and convoy departure schedules. The scale of the losses made it clear this was no coincidence. Someone was feeding the hunters precise intelligence. Suspicion soon focused on the ships anchored in Mormugao. Though they appeared inactive, their strategic position made them ideal covert radio stations. By late 1942, intercepted intelligence even revealed a human element in the plot. A courier moving through the streets of Goa, linking the ships to the German submarine command. The ghostly vessels were very much alive. The trail led to the administrative heart of Goa, the quiet town of Panaji. Beneath its palm trees and Portuguese colonial facades lurked a key figure, Robert, a German citizen, seemingly harmless, living with his wife, Greta, in an apparently mundane routine, blending into the foreign community through social gatherings. But to British intelligence, Robert was far more. Codenamed Trumpeter, he was the human link between the Ehrenfels and the German submarine high command, suspected of gathering data from Axis sympathizers in the ports of the British Raj, relayed through the freighter's secret radio. The order to neutralize him came straight from London. He had to be eliminated, even if it meant violating Portuguese neutrality and risking a diplomatic crisis of immense proportions. In November 1942, the SOE tasked two seasoned operatives with the mission, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Pugh and Colonel Valentine Stewart, with forged documents and cover stories. They spent weeks shadowing Robert, memorizing his routines, and preparing for the perfect moment to strike. On December 19th, they set the trap. Through a carefully orchestrated deception, Robert and Greta were lured from their home and abducted. Under cover of darkness, they were smuggled across the border back to British India. Their destination, Castle Rock, a remote outpost in the Western Ghats, where isolation ensured interrogations without witnesses. There, amid mountains and jungle, the darkest curtain of intelligence work was drawn to force an ordinary man to reveal the invisible machinery devastating Allied seas. The interrogation unveiled the true scale of the threat. The Ehrenfels was no rusted hulk, but a sophisticated command center in disguise. Equipped with powerful transmitters, it served as the heart of a vast espionage network, gathering reports from multiple ports across the subcontinent. Informants embedded in shipping companies and railways passed details of convoys and cargoes to Robert, who in turn relayed them in code to the freighter. From there, operators transmitted the data to U-boats, patrolling the Indian Ocean, enabling them to strike with surgical precision. Suddenly, the seemingly random shipwrecks made sense. It was a perfectly orchestrated hunt, conducted from within a neutral port. What began as a minor suspicion revealed itself as one of the Axis's most effective intelligence coups of the war. Of Robert and Greta's final fate, little is known. After the interrogations, they vanished from official records. No trial, no repatriation, not even a trace in public archives. Some claim they were resettled with new identities, possibly used as double agents. Others believe they met a darker fate, erased forever in the name of security. But though Robert vanished, the problem persisted. The Ehrenfels continued transmitting. Allied losses mounted, and British diplomatic protests to Portugal were ignored. Lisbon, steadfast in its neutrality, effectively shielded the German merchant ships, blocking any legal action. By March 1943, U-boat activity peaked in the Indian Ocean, sinking a dozen ships in a single week and depriving Allied armies of tens of thousands of tons of vital supplies. The evidence was now undeniable. The Ehrenfels was the epicenter of the catastrophe. If not destroyed, the lifeblood of the Allied war effort would be choked. But London faced an impossible dilemma. It could not act openly, without violating Portuguese sovereignty and risking a diplomatic conflict. The only solution was the impossible, a covert operation, with no official soldiers or recognition, to eliminate the threat while allowing plausible deniability. Thus, the idea was born, to recruit men outside the regular military. Lewis Pugh turned to the Calcutta Light Horse, a colonial cavalry regiment, composed mostly of merchants and retired veterans. Half in jest, half in earnest, they were weekend soldiers, men more accustomed to cocktails than combat. Yet, they would become the unlikely heroes of one of the most improbable raids of World War II. When Pugh explained the mission, he did so with brutal honesty. They needed men willing to risk their lives without medals, without pensions, and without public recognition. The operation would last mere weeks and involve a perilous sea journey with minimal chances of success. Commander Bill Grice, leader of the Calcutta Light Horse, gathered his men and laid out the offer plainly. Against all logic, every man present raised their hand without hesitation. The selection was swift, weeding out the oldest or physically unfit. Though even a volunteer with a glass, I was accepted with a nod to Nelson's legacy. Thus, a team of 18 men was formed, bolstered by a few Scots from Calcutta, a microcosm of British colonialism. Merchants, farmers, bankers, and ex-soldiers, united by a barely understood objective. Preparation was a whirlwind. In just days, they underwent intensive training in boarding techniques, demolitions, and battlefield first aid, memorizing the Ehrenfels' layout, rehearsing raids on makeshift models, and learning the discipline of real combat, though many hadn't held a weapon in decades. Each night, under Calcutta's humid heat, they practiced assault maneuvers in mock corridors, imagining the resistance awaiting in the freighter's dark compartments. There was no room for error. The operation hinged on speed, coordination, and the critical element of surprise. Meanwhile, in the Lee's offices, a plan as audacious as it was improbable took shape, relying on the most absurd disguise possible to justify the presence of these gentlemen. In Portuguese waters, the crafted alibi seemed straight out of a farce. The men would pose as revelers on a pleasure cruise, drunk on rum and music, sailing in an unremarkable vessel. To that end, they were assigned the HMS Phoebe, an old dredging pontoon, slow, rusty, and little more than a floating barge. Its very harmless appearance made it the perfect disguise. At the helm was Commander Bernard Davies, a Royal Navy veteran whose calm demeanor inspired confidence among these makeshift commandos. The night of the raid coincided with Goa's carnival celebrations, a sea of costumes, dances, and alcohol spilling through the streets of Vasco da Gama. Using secret SOE funds, a massive party was organized, drawing German and Italian sailors, eager to escape the monotony of their idle ships for a few hours. The plan worked flawlessly. That night, as the city pulsed with drums and masks, most of the enemy crews abandoned their ships to join the festivities. In the harbor, the Ehrenfels lay nearly deserted, guarded only by a skeleton crew, as if fate itself conspired in their favor. The harbor lighthouse and the signal buoy mysteriously went dark, plunging the bay into complete darkness. In that expectant silence, the Phoebe started its engines. It was the early morning of March 9th of 1943, slow and cumbersome. The barge glided toward the immense shadow of the German merchant ship. Under cover, the 18 men took deep breaths, armed with Sten guns, Mills grenades, and explosive charges. Each creak of the hull sounded like thunder. Each meter advanced, a countdown to glory or annihilation. With a metallic crash, the Phoebe rammed the side of the Ehrenfels. The impact was the signal. The commandos climbed aboard like shadows, storming the deck amid cries of surprise. From the few Germans present, in the confusion, some crew members barely managed to escape in their underwear before facing the fire of British Sten guns. The fight spread through narrow corridors, amid emergency lights casting ghostly shadows. Pugh led the column, clearing the way to the heart of the ship, the radio room. Among transmitters, codes, and encryption equipment, the British fought in a brief and brutal skirmish. Before taking control, there was no time to waste. They began destroying the equipment with methodical violence, ripping out cables, setting papers ablaze, and preparing charges for the final destruction of the German operations nerve center. The detonation shook the ship violently. The radio room became an inferno of fire and shrapnel. The transmitters and encryption equipment were reduced to glowing scrap. The heart of the German espionage network in the Indian Ocean was destroyed in seconds. The commandos, ears ringing from the blast, began their retreat through smoke-filled corridors, herding prisoners, and hastily gathering documents. Under cover, the flames illuminated the bay, revealing a chaotic spectacle to Portuguese eyes. The Renfels, its superstructure warped by heat, while the surviving crew tried to react. Some Germans resisted to the end, fighting desperately but were cut down. The mission, though dangerous, was proceeding as planned. The transmitter was destroyed, and the backbone of Nazi intelligence was broken. The chaos aboard the Renfels spread to the other 3 merchant ships anchored in Mormugao: the Drachenfels, the Braunfels, and the Amphora. The sailors realized instantly that the British weren't after just one ship. They were coming for all of them before allowing their ships to be captured. The Germans and Italians opened valves and hatches, deliberately sinking their own vessels. The roar of water flooding the holds echoed through the night like a funeral dirge. One by one, the hulls began to list, tilting toward death at the bottom of the harbor. By the time the Portuguese arrived, the ships were already submerged skeletons. The Renfels, in flames and mortally wounded, began to sink as well, while the commandos raced against time to escape. The scene was apocalyptic. For steel giants, sinking in the middle of a neutral harbor, the British worked with precision, under the deadly pressure of the collective shipwreck. As the decks tilted dangerously, they cut mooring lines, collected maps, and took prisoners. The Phoebe, still clinging to the side of the Renfels, shuddered with each groan of the dying colossus. With masterful maneuvers, the commander managed to free the old barge from the lethal embrace of the sinking merchant ship. On board, the men breathed heavily, drenched in sweat, aware that every second of delay could mean being swallowed by the sea alongside their enemies. The key message was transmitted by radio. Longshank, that simple word, confirmed the impossible. The operation had achieved its objectives. The German network in the Indian Ocean was shattered, their ships destroyed, their codes burned. It was the most unlikely victory of a group of volunteers who had set out disguised as drunken tourists. The Portuguese authorities reacted with bewilderment. In an attempt to save face, local courts blamed the German sailors themselves for sabotaging their ships to avoid capture. In this way, Lisbon maintained its neutrality intact and avoided a diplomatic conflict with London. The prisoners were confined in Aguada prison until the end of the war, while colonial newspapers reported the official story of an alleged mutiny aboard the merchant ships. For the British, silence was a blessing. The success of the operation lay in the fact that no one could prove their involvement. And yet, the results were immediate and tangible. In the weeks that followed, the ocean ceased to be a slaughterhouse. Of the 13 German submarines active in March, only one managed to sink a ship. The difference was staggering. The strike against the Renfels marked a turning point. During April 1943, German sinkings barely reached 3 ships, a stark contrast to the massacre of previous months. The submarines, deprived of precise information, were reduced to roaming predators, attacking at random in an ocean too vast to cover effectively. The Third Reich's secret weapon in the Indian Ocean had been neutralized by a group of men who, in their everyday lives, would never have imagined achieving such a feat. None received medals or decorations, nor were their names mentioned in official reports. The secret had to be kept. They themselves, aware of what they had accomplished, created an emblem, a seahorse, symbolizing the audacity of that raid. It was their own silent tribute, a private memory that for one night, they changed the course of the war. After India's independence in 1947, the Calcutta Light Horse and the Calcutta Scottish were disbanded, their members scattered across the new post-colonial world. For decades, the operation remained in the shadows of official secrecy. Only in 1974, when British documents were declassified, did the story of that night in Goa come to light. The world was astonished to learn that the German network in the Indian Ocean had been destroyed not by elite forces, but by middle-aged merchants and veterans disguised as tourists. In 1978, the journalist James Leeser immortalized the story in his book Boarding Party, and 2 years later, Hollywood brought the feat to the screen in The Sea Wolves. With Gregory Peck, Roger Moore, and David Niven, the myth had become legend, but the truth was even more incredible than fiction. Meanwhile, the wrecks of the sunken ships remained silent beneath the waters of Mormugao Harbor. In 1951, the port of Goa organized the salvage and scrapping of the hulls, with the help of a German engineer who had stayed after the war. Decades later, new demolition projects removed the last visible pieces of those giants that had once terrorized Allied convoys. The memory of their power faded beneath the waves and in the sands of time, until the story of Operation Creek began to be revalued as one of the most extraordinary episodes of naval warfare. The port, a stage for espionage and fire, regained its tropical calm, but beneath its surface lay the echo of the night, when 4 ships were sent to their doom by a handful of nameless men. With the opening of archives in 2002, unknown details emerged. Some German crew members captured during the raid agreed to collaborate with British operations in India, transforming from enemies to allies before returning to their homes after the war. The documents also confirmed that London had hoped to capture the merchant ships intact to exploit their radios and codes, but the crew's swift decision to sink them thwarted that possibility. The reality was that the mission, though it didn't fully meet its initial ambitions, achieved its primary objective, blinding the U-boats and ensuring the flow of supplies in the Indian Ocean. The cost was high in risk, but low in blood. The volunteers returned quietly to their lives, without parades or speeches, but with the intimate certainty of having tipped the scales of the war. In a forgotten region, in the years that followed, the memories of those men circulated in closed circles, shared in discreet toasts, anecdotes among comrades. No one sought fame. They knew the glory of their feat lay precisely in its anonymity. The seahorse they adopted as their emblem survived as an intimate symbol of brotherhood and audacity. In the social clubs of Calcutta, some stories slipped out over drinks, always veiled, always ambiguous. It was their way of remembering, without compromising the secret. For many, Operation Creek became proof that fate can choose the most unlikely to accomplish the most impossible tasks. They were not young professional soldiers, but men in the second half of their lives, who accepted the challenge with the ease of a gesture and returned bearing a secret that the world would only learn of 30 years later. Today, looking back, Operation Creek is remembered as one of the most improbable and decisive actions of World War II. It was a combination of espionage, audacity, and covert sacrifice that broke the Axis's most dangerous network in the Indian Ocean. Its protagonists never sought recognition, but their story proves that war is not always won with massive armies or advanced weaponry. Sometimes, the difference is made by a few men who choose to act when all seems lost. In a tropical port, under flags of neutrality, merchants and veterans disguised as tourists executed a masterstroke that dismantled an entire fleet of enemy submarines. Their feat, forgotten for decades, now stands as an eternal reminder that even the most unlikely heroes can change the course